Sooner fans, you had 2 weeks to celebrate that Texas win. How about that? You had the bye week, and of course, that's always great to have a big W going into the bye week, and none get bigger than taking on Texas and getting the job done, especially when undefeated teams are in play and the historic rivalry and the final go, of course, in the Big 12. We're talking Oklahoma football as we do each and every week here at the Voice of College Football. We appreciate you all stopping by. Leave those comments and questions there in the chat. Jason Ray will be joining us soon. And here we are for a 134th time. Of course, straight ahead for Oklahoma football is UCF. And we've got Jeff Sharon stopping by to break down the Knights for us. Of course, Jeff has joined us on a regular basis for years and years and years. You can catch his work at UCF Banneret on SB Nation. Jeff, how you doing?
How are you, Mark? It's good to see you again. It's been a while. It's our first go-around in the Big 12, so glad to be on with you again.
Absolutely. Appreciate you stopping by. And again, Jeff has joined us for years and years and years. So you want to check out Oklahoma fans, what they have in store there at UCF Banneret on SB Nation to get you all prepped for the game on both sides. Well, I think many of us believed going into the Big 12 season that this was the program probably long-term, but more specifically 2023, the program best equipped to compete immediately. We've seen pockets of that, but there's also been some obvious issues with UCF adapting.
Yeah, it's the biggest issue that UCF faces right now, as we've seen, is injuries. When John Rice Plumlee went down with that injury in the Boise State game, a game that, UCF won, but should have won by a considerably larger margin than they did due to some really silly errors. That was a real blow because he's one of the most electrifying players, not just that we've had in a long time here at UCF, but that it really in the conference, and we really believe that. A credit to Timmy McClain, the Seminole High School product, locally from Sanford, who has filled in admirably for JRP, but it's just the offense just isn't quite the same without JRP's experience back there. He was out for the Kansas State game, a game that was pretty tight into the fourth quarter until Kansas State put it away. The Baylor game, I mean, what can you possibly say about that hasn't already been said? That's a game that UCF is going to look back on for years and be like, we should have had that one. The Kansas game, the JRP tried to give it a ride. He had that knee brace out there, and you could tell after, I think, the third possession, he was just like, I just don't have it today. And I thought I had it. I wanted to give it a shot. We didn't have it. And then by that time, Kansas, who I think is a very good football team, McClain came in. The offense kind of heated up later, but, there was a point there, Mark, where UCF gave up 60 unanswered points between the second half of the Baylor game and the first half of the Kansas game. And that's just not going to do it. Coming off of a bye week, just like Oklahoma is, the hope is that Plumlee is healthy and ready to go. So we'll see what happens with him on offense.
Got Jeff Sharon here breaking down UCF football for us. Of course, the opponent, the Knights, for Oklahoma coming up this week. And as Jeff had alerted me, because I did not look at the point spread yet, 19 points is the line for these two teams coming into it. So sitting at, what is the record? 3-3?
3-3
in the Big 12. I got to think just reaching postseason play is the goal.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought that was basically the goal from the very beginning. I know you'd mentioned that some people thought that UCF was equipped to compete right away in the Big 12. I think they would have needed a lot of dominoes to fall their way if UCF was going to compete for the Big 12 championship right off the bat. And the main reason for that is something that we've talked about before when UCF was in the American, is depth. Depth is UCF has proven in the past that they can compete on a level with teams like Auburn and Georgia back in the beat Georgia in the bowl game, beat Baylor in our first BCS game that's 10 years ago already. But as you said, if when you get into the grind and guys start getting hurt, you've got to have that depth in your back pocket. And right now they just haven't. Not just offensively, I talked about John Rice Plumlee, but also defensively, Ricky Barber, who's probably might be our best defensive tackle right now, has been fighting through some injuries. We've had some injuries on the offensive line as well. We've had to change centers. We've had to move some things around, and it's a pretty tough situation, right now. But I can tell you the truth, like I mentioned earlier, nobody has needed this bye week more than UCF right now, just in an attempt to try and get healthy before they head out to Norman for the first time.
As I mentioned off the top, Oklahoma fans have been celebrating the bye week. It's given them an extra week to relish in the Texas win. We're glad to be joined by our guy Jason Ray, who hosts our post-game show here at the Voice of College Football OU, and also Sooner Tailgate every week. Jeff, Jason, Jeff. Jeff writes for UCF Banneret on SB Nation, Jason. So I'll let you guys break down the matchup coming up. So Jason, dive right in.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting matchup, really, specifically when you take out the point spread, and even at that, I think when you look at UCF, they've been very dynamic rushing the ball this year. I think third nationally overall, and where they're at. Oklahoma offensively has relied on the pass a little bit more, number 4 overall in passing yards in the country. So I think looking at both of those sides, whichever one is really able to kind of show their worth in terms of who's able to run the ball better or throw the ball better, certainly has a big advantage. Obviously, I think coming in Oklahoma, which is very rare for Oklahoma to be able to say this, but I think now this year Oklahoma comes in with a much better defense. I think UCF looks a lot like where Oklahoma I think was last year, struggling to stop the run. I know that you kind of mentioned here about the bye week, and I my apologies, I caught the middle of it, but I was very surprised that Kansas was able to do what they were able to do on the ground, specifically to the tune of almost 400 yards. So I think Oklahoma's not necessarily been in the position from a running game perspective to take advantage of that previously. Surprisingly, at least for me, Oklahoma was able to run for 200 yards against Texas. I know a lot of that was from the quarterback run game from Dylan Gabriel being able to run for over 100 yards in that game. So I think that's interesting, and I think for me, there's a few different I would call intangible things that are part of this matchup, right? When you look at Oklahoma now, after a week off the bye week, the victory against Texas, Oklahoma's in the top 10, was number 5 last week, number 6. I think for the first time in the last 2 years under Brent Venables, Oklahoma is more back to where they are accustomed to, and being the hunted versus being kind of the hunter. There's been a lot of people, as Mark had mentioned, there was a lot of celebration for, I think even you could make an argument a bit too long, for that Texas game. So how do they come back knowing, okay, this is not a team that's fighting for to be an upper level bowl team versus being 6 and 7 last year. This is a team I think right now in front of them, based on the schedule, has a real shot at winning a Big 12 championship and has a real shot of potentially getting to the college football playoff. So how do they handle that different, whether it be internally within the team in and of itself? How do the coaching staff handle that coming in? I know that there's the Dylan Gabriel dynamic with UCF and what that looks like. I don't know, if there's really much to that once the game actually gets kicked off and things like that. But no, I think it's a very interesting matchup. UCF really just kind of getting, I think, their bearings in terms of what Big 12 play, what Power 5 football looks like each and every week, versus what they've been used to in the American. So very intriguing matchup to see where both of these teams line up. And I know that you'd mentioned the bye week. I think the bye week was very big for Oklahoma as well. A couple of injuries I talked a little bit about the passing game. Oklahoma's leading wide receiver, Andrew Anthony, out for the year with an ACL injury. So what does that receiving core look like? And it's a group that's been a lot better than I think most people thought coming into the year. But still, having said that, that depth takes a little bit of a hit with that, and interested to see who steps up, what that looks like. So yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me is really kind of the differentiator between what Oklahoma was perceived nationally and maybe even locally as well with the Oklahoma media before Texas versus after Texas. So how do they handle that in terms of what that looks like, not only for this game but going forward?
Yeah, I Jason, I for one thought that Oklahoma should have been the favorite in the Big 12 coming into this year. I mean, I know I mean everyone talked about Texas, but no one knows Dylan Gabriel other than you guys better than us. His talent is undeniable. You mentioned that you were surprised about how UCF really struggled defending the run against Kansas and Kansas State. I'm really not, because those are the 12th. Kansas State's 12th in the country in rushing, and Kansas is 13th. And I think Kansas is still a dark horse to sneak into the conference championship game. They are well coached with Lance Leipold, and I was less surprised at that game, I think, anybody else. But if you're looking at this game from an intangible perspective, I mean, let's face it, this is UCF against Dylan Gabriel. Like and I know the players and coaches are going to be they're going to say the right things, right? This is just he's just the opposing quarterback. Yeah, we really appreciate what he did here and everything, but once the whistle blows, cliche, yada. Come on. You and I both know that there are some guys who are left over who remember the 2021 season and how it all went down with Dylan, where UCF, he got hurt in the Louisville game, which was a spleen rupturing loss. And then it was thought that he would be able to come back and maybe help UCF make a run to the American Championship in the very end. They were right there at the end. Mikey Keene, who's now at Fresno State, did a great job filling in for him, and he didn't. And then the day after the final regular season game against USF, he announces he's leaving. Initially, remember, for UCLA, and then he decided to go to Oklahoma and follow Jeff Levy, who was an assistant here as well. There are still some guys for whom that memory is quite fresh, I think. And will it have an impact on the game for or against either side? I don't know, but it's a factor, and it's a fun thing that we can talk about here. But you mentioned Oklahoma with the rush, has been attacking via the pass this year, not as strong against the run. UCF's weakness against the run, but I think it has been apparent. But I think that the real issue for UCF is they have not been able to force turnovers. And that's been true the last couple of years. They're near the bottom of the FBS, and not just turnover margin, but turnovers forced. They've only forced 5 turnovers in 6 games this year, and they have got to turn that around because as we know, the way UCF and Gus Malzahn like to run their offense, if that's going to work, they have to get extra possessions and turn the other team over in order to get that. And so far, they haven't been able to do that. Will they be able to do that against the number 1 team in FBS and turnover margin this year? I don't know. Stranger things have happened.
Jeff, when you look at UCF's adjustment period to the Big 12, and again, it sounds like at the outset of our conversation that you had no grand illusions of what UCF is going to be initially in the Big 12. And again, I do think that most people thought not that they would compete for a conference championship, but that they would be the most competitive of the 4 coming into the league initially. Has it been more the substandard play, more on UCF not being what they've been in the past, injuries taking a toll, substandard play, some guys not coming through as expected? Or has it been more about the Big 12 maybe being a tougher league than you and others anticipated?
It's easy to say it's a little bit of both. I think that it's really an issue of, like you were talking about, depth and injuries. It's for the week in, week out grind. I thought, we've talked about like all the different angles since 2017 when UCF went undefeated and beat Gus Malzahn and Auburn in the Peach Bowl. It's, of course, a team at that level, at the Group of Five level, could beat a Power Five team, a good Power Five team, in a one-off situation, with enough preparation, no problem. It's the week in, week out grind that makes it tough. And what happens, with your depth when your top guys get banged up? Do you have guys behind him that can step in and keep the level of play high? I think that's really the one issue. And there's and credit to Gus Malzahn, who has recruited better than any the best classes that UCF has ever seen over his 3 years in preparation for this moment. But that doesn't happen overnight. That doesn't even happen over the course of 2 nights, 2 years, really. It takes a full recruiting cycle, and sometimes more than one, for that to actually happen. We saw, and I think that the administration at UCF understands that. That's why they signed Gus Malzahn to an extension through 2027 earlier this year. The news actually broke right after the Baylor game in a rather inconvenient fashion, considering how that game played out. But he had signed that extension, in the summer, and that's a real commitment to the idea that, hey, we're in this thing for the long haul. That said, I had thought from the very beginning, like, let's see how this all plays out. I thought that the goal was get to a bowl game, and are you going to surprise some people? Yeah. Are we going to have some tough times against some opponents? Yeah. So far, we've had a lot of tough times against opponents, but I think that the way that the schedule is working out, the bye week, right smack dab in the middle of the season, I think that with some of our upcoming home games, it should shake out well for UCF to get to that 6-win plateau, get to, become bowl eligible, and let's see what happens from there. I think that should be considered a first year in a Power 5 conference, a pretty successful first year, especially when you go back and take a look at, like, for example, what TCU did in their first year in the Big 12, what Utah did in their first year in the Pac-12. Those are the two most recent entrance from the Group of Five into the Power 5. They struggled, and it took them a while, but they figured it out. And I think UCF does have the infrastructure and the administrative commitment to make that happen in the long term. The only problem is the long term is the long term. It's not the short term, So it takes time, and I get that fans are impatient, considering also how successful we've been over the last few years, but give it time, folks. We've only been playing football since 1979.
Do you tend to take a peek back at the American Conference and think, well, I wonder what we'd be doing this season in the American?
Oh, no. I'm happy to be in the Big 12. Believe me. I'm not going to, listen, playing the likes of Baylor, Oklahoma, Kansas State. We got Oklahoma State coming into our house in a couple weeks, or in a few weeks. We've got, we're matching back up against Cincinnati. We got a trip out to Lubbock. That beats the living daylights out of playing North Texas and Rice in South Florida. Believe me, any day of the week and twice on Saturday.
I heard that shot on South Florida at the end there. You included them.
I have to get one in. Come on. I have to get one.
Are they going to be part of the non-conference schedule going forward?
It's very hard to say. There have been some inklings that, perhaps maybe one day we can renew this. We can renew the war on I-4, but the main issue behind that is their schedule is filled out for the next 4 or 5 years. And now that we're in the Big 12 and playing 9 conference games instead of 8, which UCF used to in the American, that takes away one more slot where we probably could have fit them in. So if it does renew itself, it won't be for a while.
Jeff, for Oklahoma fans, anyone that they should be looking out for in this matchup, because they're probably pretty unfamiliar with the Knights?
Couple guys I want to start on offense. We've heard a lot about John Rice Plumlee, of course, who came over from Ole Miss, and has really was really making tremendous strides in year 2 before that injury against Boise. Really had made huge strides in year 2. RJ Harvey, primary running back threat. He's just a workhorse back there for UCF. But I think that, the guys who really, I think, stir the drink are the wide receivers on the outside. Javon Baker, Kobe Hudson. If those guys are able to get free in the secondary, things could get really interesting. Defensively, I have been just blown away at the kind of season that Tremont Morris Brash has been having. Go back and look at the Boise film. He is a one-man wrecking crew, and we charted it. We charted it in the second. That whole game, wherever Tremont Morris Brash was on that blue field, Boise was like, "We're not going that way. We're going the opposite way of him, because he's going to wreak absolute havoc on us," and he has been so far to this point. And he's going to have to do that again and make Dylan Gabriel's life a living hell if UCF is going to have any chance against Norman against Oklahoma.
Jason, anything else for Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I think probably the biggest burning question from Oklahoma's side is what the health of the quarterback situation is. I know that Gus Malzahn has announced that John Rice Plumlee will start this weekend against Oklahoma. Where do you feel like he is health-wise coming into this game?
Very hard to say, because Gus is notoriously good at keeping the wraps on the injury news. We didn't even have any idea that JRP would start the Kansas game until all of a sudden, he was actually heading out there. We didn't really even know about what was going on at we thought that he would be back this game, that they would keep him out through the bye week, and then he would be ready for Oklahoma. And then he comes out in full pads and uniform for the Baylor game. And we were like, what is this? Why is he dressed for this game? Yeah. And then he got the start in the Kansas game, but you could tell those the first possession, he just didn't have it. And he missed, and I think on the third possession of the game, he missed a dump off throw to RJ Harvey, and he went right back to the sidelines and got on the phone, and you could tell he was telling Darren Hinshaw up in the box. He's like, "Look, I gave it my best here. I don't have it today. You got to get Timmy in there." Yeah. Timmy McClain, the backup quarterback. So, and credit to him for the leadership on that. He's no fool on that. 2 weeks out, that's 2 more weeks for that injury to heal. He was out there in a full knee brace. We have not seen what he looks like, at least as of right now, in terms of if he's wearing something smaller. Does he look more mobile out there? We don't know. Yeah. But the one thing that we know is that his mobility is going to be key. He is a quintessential dual threat guy. And those legs are the real threat. To what extent, to what percentage he's going to have that running ability back right now is anybody's guess. I guess we're going to find out, 11 o'clock Central on Saturday.
All right. Anything else, Jason?
No, I mean, I guess the only thing, it's just interesting. I think the parallels in this game with these two teams, as you'd mentioned, UCF is. It's kind of interesting. UCF is tickled pink to be in the Big 12. Very, very happy. Whereas I think Oklahoma's of the perspective is we can't get out of this conference fast enough. And I don't think it's anything more. I don't think it's anything specifically just derogatory about the Big 12. I just think the excitement of Oklahoma being in the SEC, and I think Texas even the same way. So I think it's interesting just looking at some of these games that will be just a one-game conference season or series, I should say, is very intriguing, kind of going down the line. And you'd mentioned, Jeff, some of the struggles that UCF is having this year, which is obviously to be expected. I think Oklahoma and Texas, to a certain degree, are going to have the same struggles next year going into the SEC. There's a period there, but I think one of the biggest questions, just overall, not even talking about this game, that I think a lot of people around Oklahoma and just are very interested in, who's the third best team in this conference? Like, who is it? Is it? I mean, it's so bizarre that you can make a case for about 4 or 5 different teams, right? You'd mentioned Kansas, Kansas State. Heck, you could almost make a case for Iowa State at this point, the way that they've been playing over the last few weeks, how they started against Oklahoma. Oklahoma State, which was, to me, looked like one of the worst teams in the conference. Now, all of a sudden, you can make an argument for them. So I think kind of going down the stretch within the league, I think is going to be interesting. I mean, I think it would be a shocker to everyone if Oklahoma and Texas aren't playing in the Big 12 championship game. Having said that, what Texas is notorious for slipping up against teams that they should not have any business losing to. So, if that happens, I think it's interesting to see who's the team that would be more ripe to potentially slide into that Big 12 championship game should something like that happen.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And there's there's nothing that says that, UCF couldn't find a way to sneak in if they got hot at the right time. I really do think that UCF, at least as of right now, is undervalued. But with 3 conference losses, it's hard. But as I mentioned before, we saw firsthand Kansas State, very physical football team. They have the size to compete, especially up front. We saw that firsthand. Kansas is extremely well coached. They took it to us right from the word go, and I was really impressed with that football team. So if I had to handicap it, I would say that the bronze medal right now belongs in the state of Kansas. Which one? I don't know. At least as of yet, I was still surprised at what happened with that Oklahoma State. I think that the atmosphere in Stillwater is probably, because I watched that game, I thought that the atmosphere in Stillwater pushed OK State over the top in that game. But well, let's see. I'm looking at the schedule right now. Kansas has this week off, and then they have you guys next. So I guess we're going to find out sooner or later, aren't we?
That's right.
I just know I got my wish, and that's when the 4 teams were announced to enter the Big 12. I did not want a clean transition of Oklahoma and Texas leaving the same year that the 4 new teams were coming in. I wanted a messy, awkward, at least 1 year overlap. And I got that, and which also produced games like this. Who knows when Oklahoma and UCF will ever play again? So I wanted to see as many of the new teams play Oklahoma and Texas as possible. So I got a few wishes granted here. So, all right. Again, Oklahoma fans, if you want the complete look at UCF and what to look out for entering Saturday, check out Jeff and the rest of the crew there at UCF Banneret on SB Nation. Jeff, we so much appreciate you stopping by as always, sir.
Mark, it's always good to talk to you. Jason, nice to meet you. Enjoy the game on Saturday. We'll see you guys.
All right, same to you.
All right.
All right. There we have it from the UCF side. All right. I'm sure Oklahoma fans want to hear more Sooners than Knights at this point. So we've had our fill of UCF. We know what to expect to a certain extent, which they have not competed well in the Big 12. When you look at some of these scores, like 51-22 against Kansas is bad enough, but it was 31-0. And as Jeff mentioned, between the end of the Baylor game and the beginning of the Kansas game, UCF gave up 60 consecutive points. So,
yeah, I think one of the things that's very interesting to me is just looking at the UCF side. They've had 2, really bad games consecutively. So, I mean, that's probably part of this point why the bye week came at such a good time with their epic collapse against Baylor, and then certainly giving up. Kansas passed through the ball, had 12 pass attempts in that game. That's something you very rarely see, and they didn't have any reason to pass the ball. They ran for almost 400 yards in that game. So they've had 2 really, really bad performances back to back. So how do they how did they come back from that is really, really interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, from the Oklahoma perspective, I don't know. I mean, it's I've had some of these discussions with some of guys that have kind of some insight into the program, and it felt like the celebration went on a little too long for me. And I get it, like where Oklahoma was at last year. The fan base and the team and every coaching staff, all of them were ready for something, and this was the moment they had. The last moment. That specifically after the 49-0 loss last year. But there was 3 or 4 different, I think, things that the official Oklahoma account Twitter feed came out with. Still, like even on like Friday and Saturday of last week. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see. Maybe it's nothing. I just hope, I hope and this is one thing that I always tell don't let one big game be one game in the regular season be the highlight of the season, right? You don't want, if you're Oklahoma, you don't want this win to be the highlight of the season. Understanding how big of a game it is, right? I mean, I think we all do, but how do they move forward from that? There is, I think Barry Switzer years ago named this. There is such a thing as a Texas hangover for Oklahoma. There's been years and years and years where Oklahoma has really struggled the week after. I think the bye week helps in that fashion, to a little bit of it to a smaller degree. But yeah, I mean, how do they react from that and being pat on the back a lot? I think that's a big thing that I know probably between those walls they expected to win this game. They expected to be where they're at, and so I think it's. I mean, there was and Mark, I'm sure you've seen this as well. There was a slight pause or maybe a shift in celebration from the Texas win to the USC loss on Saturday night. And, the Oklahoma Twitter is just they're very. I mean, they got into it with Matt Leinart over the weekend, and it went on and on and on. So I think, and Brandon Walker, I don't know if you follow him from Barstool, but it's some nonsense that most of the stuff that he puts out there. But he had like a short little video that said Oklahoma fans' 2 favorite teams each weekend is Oklahoma and whoever USC plays, and it's, I think it really is, Mark. I mean he's on the money with that. It's certainly taken over. I mean, I think in my mind, it's taken over Texas. It's taken over Oklahoma State. It's USC, and the people, like the sheer number of people, even that I follow on Twitter, that were like retweeting the Riley and Caleb Williams press conference afterwards. And I think it's funny. I think there was just so many. I mean, we're getting off into a different topic here, but I think there's just so many parallels because USC fans are like, are the consensus are. This is what Oklahoma fans have been telling us about for the last year and a half, 2 years, and I think Oklahoma fans are looking at some of the things that Riley is saying, and it's like if you could just record Lincoln Riley's press conferences towards the end of the year in 2021 and just play it. He's saying the same things. So I think it brings back PTSD, but it's interesting to watch and to follow. I'm me personally, like I'm kind of the opinion, like let's move on, like let's let it go, like it. I mean, but it's just one of those teams that I think Oklahoma forever, for now on, is just going to be a team that roots for that whoever USC is playing to win each week.
And just to be clear and upfront and transparent about how we approach it here at the Voice of College Football, and I just think this is sensible, but we also try to have a level of class. Is we just cover the sport, we just cover the games, cover the sport, cover the news, and when nonsense like this goes on, well, there's a dividing line at some point. So for us, it's basically, we don't get into all that all the time, and we certainly don't stir it up or start it. But if it itself becomes a story, then it's a story, and it's what people are talking about. It's what the fans want to hear. So at some point, that is part of the landscape of covering the teams and the sports, is doing what the fans are partaking in. And so if that's it, then we will dive into that and discuss that, because that's what it is. And maybe we should start taking all of our USC content, all of our post games and everything, and simulcasting them over here. But the guys that do the USC post game for us do say that a lot of Oklahoma fans make it over there. So
yeah, I'm not surprised, and I think part of it had to do with the bye week, right? There was not a whole lot, else to talk through. But yeah, Oklahoma fans are going to continue to get in the delight of any kind of negative stuff that happens with with USC. And I think the thing that's interesting about what was interesting about that game is USC, along with Oklahoma, has been maligned for their defense. Their defense actually played pretty well on that game. So I think the only real takeaway that I had from that game, the biggest takeaway is, it doesn't really impact Oklahoma in the least right now. The only impact is, with Dylan Gabriel's performance against Texas, he's sort of kind of elevated himself into that Heisman conversation. He's certainly not a front runner, but I think he's probably in the short list of about 5 or 6 guys that are there right now. And I think with Caleb Williams' performance, he's already behind. He was already going to be behind the 8 ball about not a whole lot. There's certain people out there that don't want the same person to win back-to-back years, even if he's deserving. But I think this performance certainly will put him back. So I think, for Dylan Gabriel, it gives him another opportunity here coming down the stretch. But with Oklahoma coming down the stretch, I think it's when you look at, because now the real conversation mark, I think, comes for Oklahoma. Can they finish this thing off, right? Can they finish the season undefeated? They're going to be overwhelming favorites to win the rest of their games. I mean, they are. I mean, when you maybe even double-digit favorites the rest of the way. I mean, you've got 3 tricky road games against Kansas, BYU, and Oklahoma State, right? But the 3 of those teams are not even remotely on the same level that Texas is, right? Particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Kansas, all 3 of them have played pretty poorly on defense. And, we were here talking last week, and both of us kind of agreed that West Virginia probably was one of Oklahoma's toughest games. And, they did not play well defensively against Houston. I think that was a Thursday night game, right? Or Thursday or Friday. And so I think that's the thing, Mark. This team's going to be, like I said, overwhelming favorites. Can they finish the job over these last 6 games? And they're split 3-3. Oklahoma State's going to be, I think it's a little bit of a tougher game than we thought maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. But this Big 12, man, it's like it's Jekyll and Hyde from week to week. Like, you have no idea. Like, Kansas State looked awful 2 weeks ago against Oklahoma State, and actually played pretty well Saturday night against Texas Tech. Kansas is kind of the same way. They played really well against UCF a few weeks ago. Played really good for the first half against Oklahoma State, and then really kind of struggled down the stretch offensively. So, and I think Oklahoma's in a situation unlike years past where when you start to think about the playoff conversation, their resume is not going to be as strong as the other conferences, right? So they are going to have to go undefeated, obviously with a win against Texas or whomever in the Big 12 championship game, because I think, Mark, you're going to get into a situation because Oklahoma's going probably probably not going to have another ranked opponent this year. They're only, I think, Kansas was ranked last week. I think the only opportunity was for them to win that game against Oklahoma State to be ranked. So be that as it may, Oklahoma's not going to play. They're going to have one ranked win all year if it comes down to it. So when you look at the relative strength of the Pac-12 and the SEC and the Big Ten, I think it will be an interesting conversation. I wouldn't see a situation where a 13-0 Oklahoma team gets left out of the playoff, especially if it's over 2 wins or over Texas. However, if someone else slides into that Big 12 championship game, I know Oklahoma fans probably would hate to hear this, but there is a real chance that a 1-loss Ohio State, a 1-loss Michigan, a 1-loss Oregon, a 1-loss Washington, pick your team in the Big Ten, Pac-12, right? The SEC is a little bit different, right? I think you've got Georgia, as many believe, is obviously the top team in that conference, and you've got some others. Bama's not near as good as they've been in the past, but still, from a resume perspective, I think that's going to be very intriguing if it gets to that point where there's consideration. So I think definitely a 1-loss Oklahoma team, probably even a Big 12 championship 1-loss team probably doesn't make it, depending on what happens elsewhere. But I think we're headed for a very intriguing, really, really intriguing end of the year, because and certainly defer to you with this, but I think this is one of the first years there's not really an overwhelming favorite. Like, Georgia has shown some chinks in the armor, and the Brock Bowers injury is very, very significant for them. Michigan looks like the best team in the country probably right now, but they've not remotely been tested. They're not really going to get tested until they play Penn State. Ohio State's been tested, right? But they do have to go to Ann Arbor to end the year. So I don't know. It's going to be very wide open all across for all 5 of these conferences.
This could be a nightmare scenario for the college football playoff selection committee. And it doesn't have to be one scenario. There's about 50 that are nightmares. Any kind of wins back and forth in a rotation between Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan that creates an 11-1, 11-1, 11-1. And then, of course, one by tiebreaker goes to the Big Ten championship game and will be an overwhelming favorite, 20-point favorite win. So then, you're talking about those 2 teams that get left out. If there's 2 of them that are 11-1, wow. And they've, especially Ohio State and Michigan, have been in the top 2 or 3 ranked all season. The SEC, if Georgia's undefeated and Alabama, let's say, wins a SEC title game by a field goal and creates a 2-team situation there to be considered. And then the Pac-12 is just, you got to think either it's going to cannibalize itself at the top to some extent, or there could be a situation there that's similar to what's happening in the Big Ten, where there's like 3 teams that look really, really good. We'll have to see how these games play out. The Pac-12 is mighty interesting in that it certainly has the most games that you have to keep an eye on, because it's just got the most number of teams that are vying for. So every week there's like 3 games that are meaningful in that conference, where you can pretty much pinpoint the 2 or 3 key games in every conference other than the Pac-12 right now.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Mark. And we haven't even talked about Florida State that much.
No.
Can they run the table and win that ACC? So, yeah, it would be so. For me, first of all, let's just cancel the Big Ten championship game. Like, can we? Like, at this point, like, whoever it is, if it's Michigan, if it's Penn State, if it's Ohio
we're gonna clip this off, Jason. We're gonna play it on our Iowa channel.
No, I'm kidding. But I saw something the other day that said that put some analytics behind who right now had the highest percentage to make it. And I think it's Iowa, but whoever would be Ohio State, I think would be a 20-point pick if that was who they were. But yeah, I mean, the Big 12 used to go, and stuff like that is taking care of itself, right, with the elimination of divisions, and that'll get rid of. But we were thinking about this the other day. How incredible would it be if this was the year that we had the 12-team playoff? Like this was year one, because like it would make all these games are interesting, down the stretch, but some of these teams that have one loss and and they lose another one. I mean, we talked about USC, like their schedule is very, very difficult down the stretch. I think they have Cal, I think, is the only opponent that is not top 25 right now over the last 5 or 6 games. So they could take another loss or two and still find themselves there, and just overall Pac-12, just in terms of, to your point about cannibalizing themselves with some of those matchups. But and who wouldn't love to see? I mean, with some of these Group of 5 teams on how they would compete, but wouldn't it be awesome just to see Air Force in a college football playoff? I mean, that would be just. I mean, to me, it's always Air Force plays Navy this week. It's always awesome watching the service academies play each other and just how they're able to put together such competitive teams, and specifically Air Force this year. But wouldn't that? I mean, that would be just very interesting to me. So, yeah, I mean, I think this would be a perfect year for the 12-team playoff.
It really would. In terms of the playoff itself, now the thing that I would question would be sitting here mid to late October. I guess we would just figure, okay, Oklahoma and Texas are going to be in the playoff. They're going to be in the playoff. Now, who's going to get the bye? Who's going to win the Big 12 to get that bye? Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, they're all going to be in the playoff. We would be stating that right now with 6 weeks left in the season.
Right.
They're all in the playoff. Now, where they're going to get seeded, that when you frame it that way, it seems to take quite a bit out of the regular season.
Yeah, it really does, Mark. And I think that, the consideration that is interesting when you look at the, going forward, when you look at the playoffs with these home teams, higher seeded teams hosting the first round, how big of an impact does weather play into some of these games, specifically when you take some of these teams in the Big Ten? What does that weather situation look like in the second week in December? But yeah, I mean, I think there's an argument that can be made that, and I think traditionally the argument is, you increase the number of teams, you water down the regular season to a certain degree, and I think that's a fair statement. There's certain points of the regular season that maybe aren't as big as they were before, but again, I think me and you have always been very consistent on this. There's a greater number of games that will have more meaning, going down the stretch than what there has been. Like take LSU, for example. They're completely out of the race at this point, right? Completely out of the race now. With this new schedule, with this new format next year, they could find their way back into and a large berth should that situation happen. So there's teams like that, games like that. Notre Dame is another perfect example as well. That could find their way back in there. So I'm excited for it. There's, to your point, there's Big Ten, as you mentioned, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. They're all going to be in the playoff, barring some kind of epic collapse by one of the three of them.
Yeah. Now, granted, yes, and just to clarify what Jason and I are talking about, and we've talked about this a number of times, and yeah, we're on the same page that yes, there will be instances with this 12-team playoff that you can point to a game and say, these two teams are undefeated. It's late in the season. They're both making the playoffs. This game would have been Titanic previously. Now it's not. But for every one of those, there are scads, dozens of games that now become significant going forward, where you have an 8-2 LSU team or 8-2 Clemson team playing late in the season, and they're playing for their playoff life versus before in the current state, the game's meaningless. They can't get to the college football playoff. So I am looking forward to it. I do think, and even with my example of the three Big Ten teams right now, well, they're going to have USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon sprinkled into their schedule starting next year. So when that Big Ten schedule, I don't know if you saw it, it was last week. The next 5 seasons were released. The Big Ten released 5 years of schedules. And we came on here and I just did it as an exercise to basically take the teams in the Big Ten Western Division in particular and take their current schedule. And you can pretty much formulaically look at who they currently play in the East and then who they play in the West and eliminate the teams that they're playing in the West and just see how many teams they are going to be playing in the West, which is currently 6. It's going to go down to like 3 and replace them with 2 or 3 teams from the West Coast, from the Pac-12, and or an extra team in the Big Ten East. And those schedules are just poor Indiana, poor Northwestern. Their schedules just, the difficulty just skyrockets.
Oh yeah, it really does. I think one. I mean, and
It's
I didn't
brutal.
study near to the depth that you did, but I think, of course, no one's going to feel sorry for them based on that. So, but when you look at Michigan, like their schedule next year, comparatively against what it's been these last couple of years, is much more difficult. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're at from a conference perspective. That some of these, with these different entrances to name your conference, whatever it whatever it looks like. We still got a couple that we don't even know what it's going to look like. What's going to happen with Washington State and Oregon State? Where do they end up heading? So, but yeah, no, you're right. I mean, some of those teams, it's going to be a struggle for some of them to compete. Right, like we've seen like Rutgers, for example. They're never going to be able to compete in the Big Ten, not on a consistent basis. They may have a year or two here where they're, a 7 or 8 win team, right? But they're never going to be a team that's really going to compete for a conference championship or in this day and age, or in the 14 playoff, not a playoff spot. And so now I think you're adding to some of those teams that really, based on their schedule, really won't have that same opportunity. And I'm curious about, I think the Big 12 probably saved themselves in the future with the addition of like teams like Utah and even Colorado to a certain degree, to still have that ability to have an automatic qualifier. But I know there's discussions about what do they do with that. Do they move it to 4 automatic qualifiers for the winners? And so, but I think back to the original point about some of these games that we've talked about, like we all assume that Oklahoma and Texas are going to make their way back to facing each other in Arlington. That's going to be a do or die game, right? This year, the winner's going to make the playoff. The loser's going to have a New Year's Six bowl. Now, so everything's on the line potentially, if neither team loses between now and then, and then if this were to happen next year, then both teams are making the playoffs certainly at that point, but it's just where they're seeding. So it still means a lot, but it means different things. So I think that's really interesting and will be a good development as we move forward on some of those games.
And Jason, you brought up something earlier about the bye week and Oklahoma's celebration. Now, what the fans are doing versus what the team is doing, who knows? But that there was indication based on some of your conversations with people that have connections that, yeah, maybe the celebration has lasted a little bit too long, even for the team. And, this is something that I know Urban Meyer has said through the years, Nick Saban has said through the years, and now I think those are the first two guys that I remember hearing say this, 10, 15 years ago. But now you hear coaches say this a lot, that first 24 hours after a big win is celebration. We'll give you 24 hours to celebrate, and then we are forgetting this and moving on, and it's next target, next mission. What I thought of when you mentioned that was, number one, Oklahoma's benefiting from the bye here. They didn't have to turn around and play after Texas. And number two, they're benefiting from the schedule. So imagine how many big games are going to be starting next season. And it's not always going to be Texas and as big as Texas in that rivalry. But in a way, it's some of these games are going to feel, I don't want to blaspheme against Oklahoma and Texas in any way, but feel a little bit bigger just because they're new, they're fresh, they're exciting. Going to Death Valley playing LSU. Well, you win that game and get all hyped and excited and let that hang over. Well, you might be going to Ole Miss the next week, or, there's not going to be much breathing room at all going forward.
No, you're absolutely right. And, to be clear, I don't know that there's a lot of, it's hard to ascertain. I don't know that this is necessarily happening in terms of the celebration with the team. They seemed, Brent Venables and the team seem to be saying the right things in terms of that. And like I say, I don't mean to undervalue in any respect the win. It's the biggest. We talked about this after last week, right, where this is probably the biggest win that Oklahoma has had since Ohio State a few years ago. 2017. So it's been a while since a really big time win, and Oklahoma's seen the benefits on and off the field of this win. On the field, obviously they've put themselves in a good position to to get back to the Big 12 championship game. They put themselves in a good position to potentially get back into a playoff, which I think most diehard OU fans would say that was sort of a kind of a pipe dream, right? I mean, I think most people, we want to see marked improvement from last year to this year. But playoff was not necessarily out of the question, but not something that there was, a lot of thoughts. And there's a lot of benefits Oklahoma's seeing off the field. Oklahoma's doing, like, from a recruiting perspective. There's three guys that Oklahoma, I mean, they were in on, but now they're really big time leaning Oklahoma. A couple of offensive linemen and one linebacker as well. So I think that's beneficial. But I think at the same time, you just want to make sure that this isn't the complete highlight, the best thing that happens all year for Oklahoma. And even, I guess, if it does, it's still a nice thing to have. But I think now your goals are maybe sped up a year, right? I mean, I think getting to the playoffs, I think would be ahead of schedule a bit based on where they started last year. So a lot of football to go. There's interesting. I mean, like I said, there's interesting matchups. Oklahoma State. I mean, you have to know that they are going to be, like, amped to the nth degree to beat Oklahoma in their last game of the Big 12 before they stop playing again for a while. BYU, the weather in Provo in November, I think it's the 17th of November, if I remember right, towards the latter part of November at least, will be unpredictable. And then, Kansas is probably that's the first one that they face, which is next week. You have to account for a team that's really good offensively, maybe not as good on the defensive side of the ball, particularly stopping the run. But again, these are tough environments that now. It's always been the case, but I think very specifically now that Oklahoma's going to get these teams' best shots. So even the perceived weakness of the schedule, not having a top 25 team remaining, still there'll be some interesting matchups down the stretch for Oklahoma for sure.
All right, folks, remember to join Jason right after the game against UCF right here at the Voice of College Football for the Sooner post-game show. And keep in mind that we've got a Big 12 channel. So a few of you may be watching on the Big 12 channel, but most of you on the Oklahoma channel. So we've got a Big 12 channel. So please join us there. We actually don't know how long we'll be here on the Oklahoma channel. So please join us on the Big 12 channel and at the Voice of College Football. Do we have a Sooner tailgate plan for this week?
Yes, I will plan on doing that normal time. We didn't do one last week because of the bye week, but certainly we'll do that again this week.
Here we go, folks. Sooner tailgate live coming up on Friday afternoon. So join Jason right here for Sooner tailgate live. Bring your comments and questions. All right, Jason, appreciate you doing this as always. Enjoy the game, and we will see you next on Sooner tailgate. And everybody make it on back next Wednesday for Sooners Live here